Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the Association Voices of Nuclear. My name is Silvio. I will be your host today. I'm a member of the association since last year. I live in Luxembourg. I work here as an IT specialist, and I joined the association because I really think that there's a lot of misinformation going on around about the nuclear power. So thank you for joining us today. Especially thank you to our speakers who connect from very different parts of the world. Naoto is located in London, and Andrew is even further away as he's in Ottawa in Canada. And this is our second webinar on topics surrounding the tsunami of 2011 and the effects it unfortunately had on the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Maybe you attended the first webinar last night where we had the two other speakers, and they presented first how the accident unfolded and then the consequences it had on the population. If you didn't watch it, you can still see it in the Voices of Nuclear YouTube channel. It's going to stay there recorded. Tonight, we want to cover two other topics. First, we'll have Andrew, and he'll talk to us about the media coverage that the accident received around the world and how this coverage affected public opinions and then energy policies around the world. And then in the second part, Naoto will explain the decontamination and decommissioning processes which are now taking place at the Fukushima plant. Yesterday, during the webinar, I learned quite a few things myself, so I really hope that you are going to find this session interesting. In any case, you can ask any questions in the chat, either in French or in English. And then at the end of both presentations, we'll try our best to answer them. Before we really start diving into the contents, I will let Mirto, who is the president of our association, to say a few words. Mirto?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Silvio. Thank you, everyone, to all of you watching first for joining us today. Thank you, of course, to our speakers that have agreed to talk to us and to you in particular tonight. We do think it's a very important subject. We know it's not an easy subject, so thank you, everyone. Based on that, I will try not to be too long, but give you a few words on who we are, the Voices of Nuclear. Voices of Nuclear is a citizen-based NGO exclusively made of volunteers who've taken on their own family professional time to try to convey as factual as possible information on nuclear energy today to our fellow citizens. The point of the matter is that we have had in our own experiences, each one of us, the opportunity see through the media coverage and the general knowledge on nuclear, what that energy was actually really about, and especially what it was capable of as far as answering the challenges and the stakes that we're confronted with today. And that's, of course, climate change, but not only. That's scarcity of resources in the environment, that's air pollution and the sanitary effects of thereof, and of course, little access to power and to energy to populations in great need of it. We are, as said, exclusively made of volunteers. We have no ties to political parties, unions, industry, or any of these kinds of things. Again, we were born out of the realization that nuclear was widely excluded from the energy transition when the challenges were actually very great. So that was across the world, really, but mainly in Europe, I should say. And that defiance really spurred from misinformation. Misinformation about nuclear did reach a whole new level after the Fukushima accident, which is remembered as the Fukushima accident, but that really is the natural disaster of the earthquake followed by a tsunami that occurred on March 11, 2011, 10 years ago. And I'll finish on this. The media coverage today that we've experienced only here, would that be only here in France, where we're speaking from, has been very much focused and named as the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima accident. That should be proof enough that there is a much exaggerated focus on this accident that we need to remind here, and as much as we can, has led to sanitary effects, very little, if none, registered today from the radiations, and mostly when there has been, it's 2,200, more than 2,200 people who actually died prematurely from the effects of the evacuation. The media today that contacted us, and I'm giving you some info here, what happened today about my own personal experience, all said first that they were interested about the nuclear accident, and I had to remind them that they were not doing their memory work to the actual victims of the tsunami and the earthquake. And second, said, and that was a good thing, that they were interested about what going on in Japan and what was going on in Japan today, which of course is really important. And I had to remind them that this accident had actually worldwide repercussions on the decisions that we would take as people, people of the world confronted to the same issues. And I will stop with that because it's already a little bit long, and especially leave the floor to our speakers that I cannot thank enough for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Myrto, for the introduction. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, and this is Mr. Andrew Daniels. So Andrew studied in Toronto, in Kyoto, Hong Kong, and Ottawa, and now he's a historian. He wrote about quite a few things. He's mostly interested into modern historical issues, such as the end of the communism, Rwanda, and of course, the reason why he's here tonight, nuclear power. By his own account, Andrew, a few years back, set himself on a mission to prove that the renewable power is basically full of virtues. But as he said to me earlier, the more he learned, the more he became convinced that nuclear power is a very suitable solution. So he informed himself a lot. He read a wide selection of works, engineering textbooks, history accounts, and both from a pro and anti-nuclear view. And his presentation today is a reflection on the discoveries he made during his research for his book, which is called After Fukushima, What We Now Know, A History of Nuclear Power and Radiation. So Andrew, the floor is yours, go ahead.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm going to be speaking today on a number of topics, but primarily starting with the media focus, how this played out in social media on Twitter, the press conferences within Japan, how this was seen also by the international press, and then finally, what was the result of this? What were the responses in Japan and abroad? So there's a number of topics that have emerged from that. I'm going to give a special focus to the evacuation, and then I'll sum up with some conclusions about this. So when we saw the media focusing on Fukushima, there was a tremendous amount of interest in the tsunami, but then also about the incident at the Daiichi power plant. And the approach to this was always looking for the worst case scenario. So when reporters came, they said, well, how could things become worse? How could this go to an even worse scenario than we're in now? So they weren't interested in hearing about safety or security. They wanted to hear the situation was out of control, and hearing that things were being managed was less interesting to them. They were essentially trying to trade on the drama and the excitement. And the tsunami was a singular event, but the nuclear incident ended up being one that extended through time. So the shift in focus moved rapidly from the tsunami to the incident at the Daiichi plant. And this provided a continuous feed of stories that continued for months and even years, because we're still talking about the incident at Daiichi even more than the tsunami. So this approach offered some distortions. So many believed that the disaster was worsening even once the explosions had happened. And I had a discussion with someone who told me, oh, I read in the paper paper that, it's going to worsen and worsen and worsen, even after the explosion. I said, well, no, the fuel rods are cooling. There's no new source of danger. That's just physics. Energy is continuously lost. It can't increase. He said, well, that's not what I read. And it certainly reminded me that this was what people were taking away. We saw that there were both positive and negative headlines about this, but what the takeaway many people took away was of a disaster that was increasing, of great significance, and of great danger. This kind of misinformation was also sparked by elites and experts. The head of the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States, stated erroneously, without accurate information, that there was a fire in the spent fuel pool at reactor number 4. And if you're familiar with the event, you might know that reactor number 4 was defueled. It wasn't on during the earthquake or the tsunami. And there was a mystery about why an explosion could have happened there. And he, without any evidence, decided that it came from a fuel pool on fire, and this greatly increased the anxiety and concern. Later reports showed that the spent fuel pool was never on fire, that the explosion came from hydrogen venting from reactor number 3. But this was a story that anti-nuclear opponents seized on and ran with it. One of the most prominent anti-nuclear campaigners in the Anglophone world is Helen Caldicott, the Australian doctor, who held a press conference in Montreal repeating this fuel pool claim and greatly dramatized the significance of what was going on. So what did we see in the media? We saw newspapers headlines that were evoking death. We saw things like grave times. Last chance heroes know they will die. In the Hong Kong newspaper, the South China Morning Post, it was front page news for a month. So there were other news stories, but every single day almost, you saw a Fukushima story. We saw, again, some dramatization, calling it a Chernobyl level disaster, which in many ways it wasn't. It's reported that food sales were being halted over radiation. So we saw a sense of increasing drama as it extended over time. When a newspaper prints, Tokyo says supplies are safe, what they're really trying to imply is that Tokyo is lying. The supplies are not safe. If they're saying this, there's a doubt. So I won't go into this in great detail, but again, no matter what was going on, there may be other stories that were seen as more important, but Fukushima continued and never went away. So I mentioned you could see positive headlines and negative headlines. So some people were getting an honest viewpoint of what was going on, that things were relatively safe. And some people even became convinced pro-nuclear people because of the events at Fukushima. The known anti-nuclear critic from the UK, George Monbiot, actually became a convert to nuclear power from what happened at Fukushima, because he saw this is essentially as bad as a disaster could be, and the damage is relatively limited and not unlimited. This ended up being sort of a mobilizing point for both the pro and anti-nuclear sides. Pro people were disappointed this happened, but anti-nuclear people were almost disappointed it wasn't worse, that they weren't validated. So even though, yes, there were some positive headlines that offered stories about safe and security, the overall narrative was negative, more negative than positive, talking about potential cancer risks, and saying that this was a significant event that should force us to rethink or reconsider things and thoughts about nuclear power. So one of the results of this media panic was that people felt personally affected. No matter where they were, whether they were in Finland or France or the United States, people thought this was impacting them. And the way they responded to this was by protecting themselves or responding. And so one of the things that appeared in the first week after the incident was a number of stories about potassium iodide tablets. Now, these tablets give the taker some additional iodine. So in the circumstance you were to consume contaminated food that had contaminated iodine, you would be less susceptible to it, less vulnerable. The only circumstance where it would make sense to take this is if you were intending to consume contaminated food. So even though these tablets were distributed in Japan, they realized there was no real reason for people to take them. The simple solution, and the solution is always don't eat contaminated food. There was information given about the dangers of eating local produce. So in comparison to Chernobyl, we didn't see a tremendous consumption of contaminated food, largely because people received the information in a timely manner. Japanese doctors interviewed people from the area and they assessed how much food they ate, weighing in, were they eating garden produce or other foods that would have been uncontaminated, and it was realized the danger was not very significant. Nonetheless, people in distant locations were buying these tablets, okay? Because this was appearing on CNN, Reuters, and BBC. We even saw rare cases of people taking too much iodine. And what this kind of panic was very similar to the toilet paper panic we saw at the early stages of COVID. A virus inspires disgust, so people bought sanitation products. People were upset about the radiation, so they bought what they perceived as anti-radiation tablets, even though really that's not at all what they are. The French government provided these tablets to French Polynesia, which is 9,500 kilometers away from Japan, about the same distance as France is from Hong Kong or France is from Ecuador. So despite this incredible distance, there was still this perception of, you know, you could be affected. A lesser known story was about how there was a run on salt in China, that in Beijing and Shanghai, people were buying salt thinking that this would protect them from radiation. And in many ways, it provides a similar benefit to what the tablets do, because salt that can contain iodine. And if you had a deficiency in iodine, this would have been a simple and cheap way to respond. But whether you were in China or Fukushima or France, there was no rational reason to believe you'd be affected by iodine during this period. So Twitter experienced a huge growth from the 3/11 disaster. And in many ways, this was one of their growth moments, just as CNN grew very rapidly from the 1991 Gulf War. This was an experience for Twitter. Twitter was about 5 years old, which for its growth meant it was relatively new. They had just recently allowed links to pics and videos 6 months earlier. You couldn't actually have videos embedded in your feed. So Twitter did not look like it did now. It was text and now a series of links. And the 3/11 disaster had ample visual media. The tsunami itself was visually spectacular. So Twitter became a significant medium, and it grew very rapidly within Japan, gaining 30% a growth of 30% of its users in this time period. And it became a way for people to speak, analyze the information they were taking in. And the most popular retweets came from Greenpeace, RT, which is Russia Today, CNN, the IAEA, and National Geographic. And this is one of the tsunami images, just to give us a visual image. So Japan at this time was being governed by the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, normally an opposition party. Japan's normally governed by the Liberal Democratic Party since World War II, almost without halt. So this was an unusual time when the opposition was in power, who are typically more anti-nuclear than the LDP. And the prime minister at the time Naoto, he came from an anti-nuclear faction within this opposition party. So in the Japanese politics, within political parties, there's subsets of factions within these parties, and sometimes the prime minister will change from the same party to someone else in another faction who has risen to prominence. So when this 3/11 events happened, we had an unusual circumstance where the opposition was in power and more critical and more open to an anti-nuclear narrative. Their spokesperson was Yukio Edano, who gave tireless press conferences on what was happening. He appeared in blue overalls, which was an atypical presentation for a Japanese politician who are normally more formal. He spoke off script, and he won plaudits for this, that for a lot of people, this seemed like a more honest engagement with the public than they expected, and his press conferences inspired confidence. He answered questions endlessly for hours as people continued to just bombard him with things. He did his best, and this was seen very positively, though it kind of polarized Twitter users. So there was a hashtag that circulated called Edano Nero, which means get some sleep. This showed some sympathy, saying, "You're working so hard, please take some sleep, please take a break." And he was described as dependable and reliable, tanomoshi, or even cute. Again, this is an unusual characterization, and it kind of shows an identification with him, that people were on his side. And his reliability was contrasted with the prime minister or the Japanese government as a whole, who was sometimes doubted or believed to be giving a cover story. So he contrasted considerably. So here's a couple of the meme images about get some sleep. And then his detractors felt that he was underplaying the damage, that he was soft pedaling it, and that he knew it was really dangerous. So for them, the tag was full armor Nero. So this was an image from when Edano Nero visited the Daiichi area. And as we can see, he's wearing a full hazmat suit, where everyone else is wearing sort of a very small PPE. So this kind of was seized on, that he didn't believe the information he was giving out. So what we saw in social media was the normal characteristics of social media turned on their head. As I think everyone knows by now, who has any experience with social media, it's normally very negative, argumentative, confrontational. People attack everyone's comments, nitpick. But we saw this turned on its head, where people became supportive, uncritical, avoiding confrontation and dissonance. So this was nicknamed by analysts as a disaster utopia, and the characteristics about how communication styles and social media styles change in this environment where people are trying to provide support. Some of the buzzwords in Japan were embrace the victims, yoriso, or the social bonds of friendship, solidarity, which is similar to the French concept of solidarité, kizuna. So there was a sense for Japanese people to feel affected as a whole, and that they should be supporting the people of Fukushima and supporting the people who were affected by the tsunami. So this is an image that some people may have seen, that it circulated very, very widely on social media. I remember seeing this about 10, 12 times on Facebook. And then I saw it repeated again many years after, debunking it. This was presented often as an illustration of the radiation releases from Japan affecting the entire Pacific. And it's not what it shows at all. It shows the wave height. So this was repurposed in a deliberate and consciously manipulative way to try and show another narrative. And when I saw it years after, it's because it was being constantly debunked and people were being reminded that this was not what it showed. There are other sort of more hysterical scare stories. There were websites claiming that the sea ocean floor was covered with dead sea animals from Fukushima, or that giant squid were washing up on shores, or that there was enlarged or mutant fruit from Fukushima. And these were all complete nonsense and playing on sort of old style radiation fears. Makes you think of sort of the 1950s radiation movies of a giant spider or that sort of thing. And I think it just does need to be said that within the Pacific Ocean, there is an enormous amount of natural radioactivity, and the small amount from Fukushima Daiichi was exceeded 500,000 times by the radiation already in the Pacific Ocean. So within Japan, the Daiichi incident provoked an anti-nuclear tone and an anti-nuclear movement, and there was a large anti-nuclear demonstration the same year, one of the largest in 50 years in Tokyo. There were critics. There was a professor who tweeted that the farmers who were cultivating in the Fukushima area are murderers. And he was attacked for this statement. People really pushed back because, of course, this doesn't fit with the other statements or the other concepts of embrace the victims and support people. And of course, he was wildly off at his mark. So this pushback labeled the people who were obsessed with radiation as radiation brains, hosha no. These were skeptics, conspiracy theorists who were obsessed with radioactivity. So there was an internal dialogue about this. As for other responses within Japan, foreign governments decided to close embassies. The Italian government closed their embassy in Tokyo and flew their staff home to Rome, even though Rome has higher radiation levels than Tokyo at the time. It just generally does for natural reasons. So these kind of evacuations were done without any logic, without a plan, without any need, just sort of a knee-jerk reaction. Some governments sent planes to evacuate their nationals. Colombia did that, for example. And there was a criticism within Japan for some of these foreigners who were flying away. Foreigners are called gaijin in Japan, so they were labeled flyjin, as if they're flying away. And some of these people were people who'd been living in Japan for 5 years, 10 years, for many years. And so we've seen that their commitment to Japan was insincere, that they're just bolting at the first sign of trouble. So I'd mentioned how this was a disaster that extended in time. And we saw a media narrative that continued many, many years after this. And Greenpeace decided on their 5th anniversary that they would replicate the incident in a series of tweets. So 5 years after, here's when the tsunami hit, here's when this event happened at Daiichi, and so on and so on. So they actually put out more tweets in 2016 than 2011. They changed their messaging. Initially, they would say, do not forget, and they meant don't forget those who were affected. But this message shifted to do not forget the dangers of nuclear energy. We cannot become reconciled to nuclear power. So this trades on one of Greenpeace's main policy planks about trying to fight nuclear power in all places. In Japan, there's anniversary journalism, a tradition of that. And it's normally called August journalism because it's in August when all of the war commemoration and nuclear bomb commemoration occurs. So to shift to the global response, there was a response in many different countries. The public was emotionally engaged on this, and politicians felt that they needed to respond. And by and large, this is a construction by politicians. Malcolm Gibson summed this up, and I can't put this into my own words better, so I'll read what he said. And that's, there is little evidence that populations at large in most developed countries are committedly anti-nuclear. Despite the heated and acrimonious nature of the debate, most stakeholders seem to take a more balanced view of the issues. Politicians mistake the heat of debate for major public disquiet. And I believe that statement holds true, that the perception of a great concern is often overestimated. In China, they reevaluated their nuclear power projects that they were building. China's been building many nuclear power plants, and they decided to continue on the exact same path. They decided that the benefits outweighed the risks, and that Fukushima did not represent any kind of new information that would cause them to change their plan. It is in Germany that we saw perhaps the most, well, certainly one of the greatest impacts. And that was the adjustment to the schedule of the Energiewende, the plan to abolish nuclear power and not to abolish coal and to invest in renewables. Now, this had already been long underway by this point. Angela Merkel was chancellor at the time, and she's a scientist with a PhD in chemistry, and she understands nuclear technology extremely well. She was the Minister for Nuclear Safety from 1994 to 1998, and she was generally seen as being pro-nuclear. 1 year before Fukushima, she had adjusted the Energiewende to extend nuclear power. So she was seen as being pro-nuclear, and the politics changed in 2011. She decided to adjust the schedule the other way and essentially backtrack, go 180 degrees on her policy to close things early. And this was not really for a scientific or rational reason. This was for a political reason. She saw a political threat from the rise in support for the Greens. So this was done purely to stay in power rather than for a objective safety or environmental benefit. Nuclear operators around the world did examine the Fukushima disaster and or the Fukushima incident, and decided that hydrogen recombiners and venting are important safety systems, and there was an investment in this to make sure that these systems could always deal with hydrogen gas accumulation inside reactors. This did have an impact on the number of planned nuclear power plants. The IAEA had estimated there would be X amount of growth in new nuclear capacity by 2035, and they halved this estimate as a result of the changes in attitudes and planning in 2011 and after. Italy has already abolished its nuclear power plants. In most Western and developed countries, there's a broadly pro-nuclear majority. Almost all the time. The only time this is inverted is in the year of a disaster or the year after. So 1986, 1987, 2011, 2012. And Italy abolished their nuclear power plant incident. They held a referendum that did not ask Italians, do you want to abolish nuclear power? Instead, they asked, should towns with nuclear power plants receive subsidies? Should the Italian electricity utility be able to build nuclear power plants abroad? And another was related to bond issues for the electricity utility. So none of these questions asked, should nuclear power be abolished? But a no answer on these three was interpreted by the Italian political class to mean we should abolish nuclear power. This was called a 50 billion euro mistake by a minister in the 21st century. And so Italy was planning to restart nuclear power, to go back into it. But instead, in the aftermath of Fukushima, this plan was canceled. The general trajectory was that nuclear power was on the upswing and expecting more growth, and Fukushima changed this trajectory to some degree. Within France, which is of course a country that uses an extensive amount of nuclear power, the President Hollande decided to promise to reduce nuclear power share to 50% by 2025. This was, of course, an impossible goal to ever achieve. So the timeline was revised to 2035. And once again, there was an imagination that renewables might be able to pick this up. And even when expert analyses have shown that this is just about impossible, this hasn't quite fully been assimilated by policymakers. A nuclear power plant was closed in in France, Fessenheim #1 and 2 in 2020. And this nuclear power plant, even though it's one of the oldest in France, works fantastically well. It could have run for decades more, and it produced more electrical power than all the solar panels in France. So in Germany, they decided to avoid expanding nuclear power, to reduce it, and as a result, new coal plants were built. So this shows the number of coal plants that were intended to be built in 2014. The decision to reduce nuclear power and expand coal in Germany and Japan has been found to have caused 28,000 air pollution deaths. So this was an enormously significant decision, and one that there still hasn't been adequate reflection. When we talk about reflecting on Fukushima, this should be one of the key takeaways, and one of the key points was, what was the effect of turning away from nuclear and turning to coal? To return again to Japan and the policies there, the most important policies were the evacuation, and this was a compulsory evacuation. No one was allowed to stay. This was done in haste. So we had people abandoning their coffee midway through, meals left behind. There was little packing and little preparation. Both taking the decision to take this evacuation and the way it was taken, both were damaging. And I'll go into a lot more detail about the evacuation. The other big policy was the shutdown of all the nuclear power plants in Japan and the increase in use of fossil fuels to replace it. In the interim, there was a period where electricity supplies were strained. So one of the buzzwords in Japan was jishuku. Everyone should be showing self-restraint, saving energy. This eventually ended as electricity supplies became abundant. But this again ties into the ideas of solidarity, everyone chipping in. Japan is often seen as a quite hierarchical society, but in reality, it's quite egalitarian. Western societies, we like to pretend we're very egalitarian, but we're often quite hierarchical. And in Japan, there's a huge priority on consensus. And there's often a different style of decision-making taken. There's a decision-making style called nemawashi, which means to dig around a plant for transplantation. And what this means in practice is to get all stakeholders on board with your plan. So we're not going to take a decision until everyone has more or less of a consensus. And so the nuclear power plants are not being restarted until there's some acceptance that there's been an adequate level of safety increased, and so on and so on and so on. And this reflects a different attitude to decision-making. The consequence of this decision-making is once the consensus is achieved, it's sometimes harder to disrupt. The government decided to support remediation of the Fukushima area by dealing with contaminated soils. There was a small amount of cesium contamination, and I won't go into that into great detail. I'll leave that for my colleague, Naoto YAGI, who will be speaking on this a little bit after, as well as the water treatment. Water from that passed through the Fukushima plant was stored and treated to remove contamination. So to go into detail about the evacuation, this is just a brief image to show some of the areas that were evacuated. They intended to evacuate another area, and then that decision changed. And the green here shows the areas that were people were allowed to return to by 2012. The changing evacuation policies meant that some people were evacuated twice or 3 times, which was seen as maybe poor planning or bad decision-making. The shift in Japan from nuclear to fossil fuels can be seen here. This is an estimate of how nuclear power, what the level was in 2015 and what it might be in 2030, which shows, of course, in my eyes, an unacceptably high or undesirably high use of fossil fuels. So to break it down, how exactly did this evacuation occur? I'd mentioned that there was different criteria applied at different times. We know at Chernobyl, people continued to live in the area. People decided to stay. At Fukushima, we don't know of any cases of this where people stayed secretly or deliberately. The most egregious and dangerous part of the evacuation was the evacuation of nursing homes in the towns of Minami-Soma and Soma. These were actually outside of the evacuation zones, but they decided to evacuate anyway. Now, this was done in such tremendous haste that it was extremely dangerous to the residents. There's an analysis that looked at 375 of these residents, and the loss of life expectancy from this was 11,000 days, which is many, many years, effectively. If there had been 90 days of planning for their evacuation, this life expectancy loss would have dropped to 27 days. So the haste made it 400 times greater. So there was no rational reason for it to happen in this haste. Maybe really no rational reason for it to happen at all, but certainly the way it was done was irresponsible. The risk of death among the elderly increased 270%. So certainly they would have been safer to have left in place, or if the evacuation was to be taken, it should have been taken with a lot more care. A study called the NREF study analyzed this evacuation and calculated just how much life expectancy you could gain from leaving. Okay, so this tried to weigh the costs of leaving, the dangers of leaving, and what they found was when they weigh these two elements in balance, that the evacuation was not worth it. Now, to just give a little bit of detail about their methodology, they use one of the most conservative methods to evaluate radiation, the LNT, linear no threshold theory of radiation, which we know doesn't really accurately model radiation. If anything, it greatly overestimates its damage. And even using this theory, there was no rational reason to evacuate people in Fukushima. One of the authors noted that the danger from air pollution in London cuts off 4.5 months of life expectancy to your life. So by that criteria that we used in Fukushima, London should have been evacuated just from its air pollution issues. They also briefly looked at the Chernobyl evacuation, and they found it was only defensible for a small minority of the people, and that the takeaway from this is that evacuations are basically almost never worth it for a nuclear incident. So we know that more deaths were caused by the evacuation than could have been caused by the radiation. The radiation deaths will be probably between 0 and 1, so a fraction of that under any modeling. Whereas the deaths from the evacuation, 1,100 people after 3 years, 1,700 after 4.5 years, and over 2,200 after 10 years. So that's an extremely significant toll. So we should be reflecting on this again, just like the consequence of turning to coal in the time after Fukushima. So what we've done is underestimated serious mental health impacts. And this is a general bias affecting health everywhere in the world, that we tend to overestimate physical health, which can often be quantified, measured, and studied, versus mental health, which is often qualitative and nebulous and harder to pin down. We know that the Chernobyl evacuees lost 8 years of life expectancy, not from radiation, of course, but from depression, isolation, fatalism, alcoholism, and the disruption of social and family connections. Right now, we've seen some mental health impacts from COVID, from isolation. And I think over the years, we will study this in greater detail and have a greater grasp of just exactly how this impacts people. For the children who were evacuated from Fukushima, they were largely not allowed to play outside. They got less exercise than their peers. So by the age of 11, they were 4 kilograms heavier than their other Japanese child peers. So the evacuation was not helpful. It was dangerous. It increased the dangers in a meaningful way and did not decrease danger in any meaningful way. So what happened with this story? We saw an extension of it over time. We saw a narrative of plant out of control, Daiichi still leaking radioactive water. These storylines often didn't tell you that these things were dangerous. They let the reader infer it. So this was a way to kind of keep the drama going for many, many years. And Fukushima has become a metonym for disaster. And a metonym is when you have a word that stands in for something else. So when we say Washington, when we mean the American government, Fukushima has been a metonym for the disaster and not the tsunami, the real disaster, the tsunami, but the meltdowns. So these are a couple images referencing the Olympics in Tokyo, making reference to radiation dangers. So what we're seeing is that there's an association with Fukushima and radiation for Japan as a whole, and that it's still coming up sort of years and years and years and a decade later, which is, as any expert on radiation knows, absurd, that it neither extends in time or in space in quite this way. So what did we learn? We saw that even with some of the oldest technology in use, with quite a number of failures, the impact was relatively limited. There wasn't significant or enormous radiation risks to the public. There were impacts to farming. The first year in 2011, all of those crops had to be destroyed. And then from 2012, 2015, we saw a very, very, very tiny number, less than a fraction of 1% that had to be eliminated. And then after 2015, we've seen none at all. So the impact to farming was neither long-term nor severe. And fishing didn't have any visible impacts. So what we can see is that Daiichi may represent an upper limit to the damage from a nuclear accident, and other future incidents and accidents would probably have a much smaller impact, most likely similar to that of 3 Mile Island, where there were no large radiation releases to the public, or even if they were, they would not have significant danger. So what we should be reminded of, there's a danger in overreacting. The danger can be in overreacting rather than doing nothing. We should not be taking away that there's any real reason to avoid nuclear power. If anything, this should say that the questions of safety are ended conclusively. Of course, some people have taken the opposite message, though I do believe this has shifted over time. I think that a lot of people have reflected on Daiichi over the years and seen it wasn't quite as bad as I expected or that I was led to believe. So I do think some of the media engagement on this has been ultimately positive. I think that better messaging is necessary. We live in a world where there's all kinds of conspiracy theories and misinformation with often extremely dangerous consequences. So all it means is that we must work more relentlessly to offer a brighter presentation than those who are offering misinformation. And this is, in my eyes, a winnable fight. So that's all I have. There's a brief mention of some of the papers I've cited. But thank you all for listening, and I will pass this back to our moderator and to my colleague, and I will be participating in the question and answer period after.
Okay, wow, thanks a lot, Andrew. It was really, really interesting to listen to you. And it's somehow shocking to say, to be honest, to see basically how the reaction unfolded against the figures that you gave, and then also the person yesterday from Unscare gave with regards to the actual impact or to the actual effects on the population. So it's really crazy to see this huge gap between the facts and the way they were reported. Maybe the one topic which I found the most arresting was that IAEA basically considered that the future nuclear developments are going to be divided by two. That's really crazy also. Again, given the actual
It's
impacts.
unfortunate.
Yeah. And I'm really trying hard, and I'm failing to think of another industry who suffered such a setback based on who suffered from such a setback, let's say, in comparison with the actual facts. But anyway, let's not go into the questions right now. So again, thank you. And then let's move on straight to the next presentation. And for this, we have Naoto with us today. So I'm going to introduce him in a few words. Naoto began his involvement with TEPCO as a reactor operator at the Kashiwazaki-Kariwa nuclear power plant. After the tsunami and after the nuclear accident, he participated into the decontamination and decommissioning process at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. He was a member of the robotics operation team for 1.5 years. And then since 2017, he is now a manager at TEPCO's London office, where he makes research on the European nuclear industry. And this evening, he's going to give us an overview on the processes of decontamination and decommissioning of the plant, the challenges they meet, the solution they use, and then the current situation in this very complex task, I guess. So Naoto, I'll let you do it.
Thank you for introducing me to it. I will share my. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Now you can see my screen.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm going to share what we are doing at Fukushima Daiichi right now for the decommissioning. So first, this shows the location of Fukushima Daiichi. It is facing the Pacific Ocean, about 200 kilometers, more than 200 kilometers north of Tokyo. Did you see my mouse pointing? Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you. And this is a 6-unit plant. Maybe some of the audience have listened yesterday's webinar, so some of the audience might have some understanding. So it's not loud enough. Is that okay? So sorry. Just for information, just 10 kilometers south of Fukushima Daiichi, there is a sister plant called Fukushima Dai-2 nuclear power plant, which has 4 units. And this power plant also got damage from tsunami and temporarily lost the cooling function, but the condition was much better than Fukushima Daiichi. So we finally successfully brought under control without major damage to the reactor. And a further 10 kilometers south of this Dai-2, there is a called J Village. This is football training camps. So the Japanese national team used this place, and this was constructed under the cooperation between TEPCO and the local government. And due to the location of this place, and also this cooperation before the accident between TEPCO and the local government, we could temporarily use this place as a staging area for the accident response at the Fukushima Daiichi. And I myself worked at the Fukushima Daiichi from the summer of 2011 for about 1.5 years. And I lived in a camp constructed here in J Village. Yes, so that's the idea of the location of the related key sites. So I will talk about various activities we are doing, and after that, I will briefly talk about the status of the recovery and the reconstruction of local community, and also the impact on the overall Japanese energy supply. So first, the water management. This is one of the biggest challenge we have been dealing since right after the accident. So this slide shows the overview of the recirculation cooling water into the reactor. So the reactor nuclear fuel have been melted and deposited in the containment building. So those so-called fuel debris continues to give off heat. So we have to cool by injecting continuously the water into the reactor. But because of the damage of the containment and the building, this water came out to the basement of the buildings. So we pumped up those water, heavily contaminated water from the basement, and we treated those water through various water treatment facilities. And basically we try to recirculate those treated water back into the reactor to cool down the melted fuel. But because rain is falling down, and also the groundwaters keep coming into the basement, roughly 140 tons a day. So while we try to recirculate water, but we have additional excess water every day. So we have to put into the storage tanks we constructed on site. So the amount of the water is huge, more than 1.2 million tons. How to dispose of this water is the issue. By the way, before the accident, we operated pumps, or the pumps to take out the groundwater in the vicinity of the reactor building, so that no groundwater come into the basement floor. So that is how I think many Japanese nuclear power plants operate. But because of the accident, this pump was not available, and now the groundwater kept coming into the basement. We have already restored most of those pumps, so we could decrease the groundwater level below the, we could decrease the groundwater level so that the groundwater would not come into the basement. But we are now intentionally keep this groundwater level higher than the accumulated water inside the basement, because we do not want to the contaminated water inside the building going outside the environment. So this is quite a delicate balance. So to reduce this ever increasing groundwater or the rainwater becoming contaminated water, we have made multiple countermeasures against this. So the red color box shows how we remove the contamination. So we constructed not single, but multiple water treatment facility. And the blue box shows we try not the clean water from coming into the contaminated area. So we constructed a lot of wells upstream of the reactor buildings. So we try to pump groundwater before the groundwater is coming into the reactor buildings. And we have, as I just explained, we have restored some of the original groundwater pumping up wells. And the green box shows to prevent the leakage of the contaminated water into the environment. So we installed a lot of tanks, more than 1,000 of tanks to keep those contaminated and also treated water on site.
So sorry to interrupt, Naoto,
yeah.
but what was the liquid glass about on the slide? I saw that it says improved ground with liquid glass. What is this about?
Liquid, this is how to say, it's like there was contamination, heavy contamination we found on the vicinity of this sea line, on the soil and the groundwater around this area. So to prevent those heavily contaminated groundwater going into the sea, we installed this seaside wall, and also we injected some chemicals in this area of the soil to solidify and to make a kind of walls to stop those contaminated water going into the ocean.
Okay, I see.
So
thank you.
it's a little bit, I think, technical jargon. I'm not sure if this is a proper English. Yeah. Anyway, so because of those multiple measures, we successfully so far reduced the rate of the generation of the contaminated water. Around 2014, this green chart showed the rate of the generation of the contaminated water, which roughly means the intrusion of the rainwater and the groundwater into this contaminated system. So in this area, about in average, about 500 tons of the contaminated water is generated in a day, but now, which was dramatically reduced to about 140 tons a day in average. Still, it's not small, but we have done some success, and we cannot, as you can remember, we cannot completely cut off this water inflow because we have to be very careful not to the contaminated water accumulated in the basement floor to coming out to the environment. So this is the chart showing the radioactivity monitoring in the sea of the plant. And the dashed line shows the Japanese legal limit to discharge liquid radioactive nuclei. So right after the accident, as you can see, the level was quite high, but now it was significantly reduced below the legal discharge limit. So this shows also one aspect of the success so far. So I talked about we kept this ever increasing water. So this is tanks we constructed over the past 10 years. Each tank capacity is 1,000 tons. So you can imagine how quickly we had to construct those tanks when we get 400 or 500 tons a day of increase of the contaminated water. Now we have constructed 1.3 million tons of capacity, and we have currently stored 1.2 million. And the TEPCO stated that this capacity lasts at least for the next summer or autumn time. So, but when you look at what we are using the other spaces on site, we had to keep some areas for the storage of the other waste. And also, we are now trying to retrieve fuel from those damaged reactors. So we have to construct the storage facility for those highly radioactive material. So the space is quite variable on this congested site. So the disposing of the water and make space for the area needed to the further decommissioning is one of the key challenge we are facing. So, by the way, this water is after treatment. We how to say the majority of the water are still how to say modestly radioactive. So we have to treat once again for majority of the water. But our treatment facility can remove all nuclides to the extent that we can meet the regulatory limit for discharge, except for one nuclide. That is so-called tritium, radioactive tritium. It is part of water, so it is, how to say, technically very difficult to separate this tritium from water. So that is the issue. So the government convened expert panel on how to dispose of this treated water. And they come up with 5 options. And finally, February last year, they issued final report saying the diluting and discharging into the ocean, or heating and evaporating and discharging into the atmosphere. Those 2 options are feasible, and but whichever or whatever options we take, we certainly have to face reputational damage to the local agricultural products or the fishery products. So we have to take care of this issue. And this 0.7 megabecquerel per liter this is the average levels of this radioactive tritium in the water. And that is almost 10 times higher than the legal limit to discharge. So at least you have to dilute those waters 10 times before or releasing into the, in this case, as a liquid waste. Right now, the total amount of the tritium is 800 terabecquerel. 800 terabecquerel. When you look at the nuclear facilities around the world, this tritium is certainly a challenging nuclide, but its health effect is quite limited because the radiation level or the energy it gives off is very low. So the nuclear facilities, nuclear power plant mainly around the world, is releasing those liquid waste by observing the each country's regulatory limit. So this is the disposing of the treated water into the environment is safely. We have conducted for many decades around the world. For example, when you look at those purple box, those are the CANDU reactors, which is Canadian type reactors. For example, when you look at this Bruce power plant, they release liquid waste about 800 terabecquerels in 2015. So it's almost equal amount to the total radioactive tritium we have on Fukushima Daiichi. So when you look at this green color boxes, those are the French and the UK nuclear reprocessing plant. So the reprocessing plant is known to release large radioactivity than the conventional nuclear power plant. So when you look at the French La Hague reprocessing plant, it releases 13,000 terabecquerel per year. So this is just I wanted to put into the context of the nuclear industry around the world.
Naoto, can you just remind me what's the figure in terabecquerels that the Fukushima plant is supposed to release if they empty all the tanks? What's the figure compared to the
800.
860. In comparison, La Hague, it's about almost 20,000 in 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's really not that huge. I would say it's quite the contrary, in fact.
But this is quite, it's not, how to say, very, not just technical, but quite a social problem. And a lot of local communities, especially the working for the fishery industry in Fukushima, voiced a strong complaint about the disposal of this water. It's quite understandable. And also not only Fukushima local community, but I think I could say the Japanese public in general quite worried about, concerned about how to dispose of this water. And not only Japan, neighboring Asian countries also voiced concern about this issue. So the Japanese government asked IAEA to review this issue last year, and the IAEA published its report, and they also say technically those two options, Japanese expert panel came up with feasible and the industry practice, and also IAEA is ready to support to give independent law to assist this issue. So that is water issue. Thank you for patiently listening to me. And now I'm talking about fuel. So this is a cross section of the 4 reactors. And I wanted you to focus on this blue box. This is a pool constructed inside the reactor building or the top floor of the reactor building. So we operator keep spent fuel after using power generation in reactor to put it here. So hundreds of this spent fuel are stored on those pool. Those spent fuel are highly radioactive. So you cannot simply approach spent fuel. So this water is giving the shielding from those radiation and also the cooling, this still heating spent fuel. As you can see, those buildings are damaged by hydrogen explosion at the time of the accident. So the keeping this highly radioactive spent fuel on the pool located in the damaged building is not, of course, ideal. So this is one of the high risk area we have to focus on. So now we are trying to retrieve those fuel from those pool and put into the more robust facility which we have on site. So spent fuel for Unit 4 and Unit 3, we have completed doing that. And now our focus is Unit 1 and 2. Unit 1, reactor building is damaged. Unit 3, also reactor building was heavily damaged. But just the last month, we completed retrieving those fuel by constructing this kind of new structure after removing the radioactive levels falling down on the top floor of the reactor building. For Unit 1, we plan to construct this structure capping these damaged reactors so that we would not disperse radioactive dust while we try to remove those radioactive dust, radioactive levels and retrieve spent fuel. And Unit 2, some of you might know, but thankfully, reactor building didn't experience hydrogen explosion. So the buildings looks intact, but the fuel was melted and the highly radioactive gas released from the reactor core into the reactor buildings and then released into the environment. So the inside of the reactor building is almost prohibitively radioactive for the workers to get inside. So we construct this structure next to the reactor buildings and we insert remote control equipment to retrieve spent fuel. So this is the example of how challenging the situation is for Unit 1. Walls and ceilings and the large equipment are all damaged due to the hydrogen explosion. So you cannot see any pools, but beneath of those levels, there is a pool and there is a highly radioactive spent fuel. there. So this is quite a challenging task to retrieve spent fuel from this situation. This is just some picture we have recently taken when we retrieve the last spent fuel from Unit 3. This is a significant progress, I can say, last month. That is spent fuel. Now I'm going to talk about melted fuel inside reactor core. Again, this is a cross-section of Unit 1, 2, 3. And most of the fuel are melted, and some of that coming out from the reactor pressure vessel into the larger containment vessel. So there's a fuel debris here, but some fuel debris remain still inside the pressure vessel, but some are coming out. So this is, of course, the area around here is highly radioactive. So we have sent multiple robots or the remotely operated the machine to look into the situation inside this containment. So this is the example of the picture we have taken inside the containment of Unit 2. Yeah, it's so it is actually, you can see the movie if you access to TEPCO's web page, but still picture, I think it's a little bit difficult to understand what is there. But basically, this picture is the bottom of the containment, and there are brown colored sediment or the deposit on top of the floor of this area. And 2 years ago, we even sent a kind of a robotic arm to try to touch this deposit. And some of the deposit, we can pick it up. But that is it. We haven't retrieved those deposits yet because there are many preparations we need to even retrieve those highly radioactive deposits from reactor.
So the brown part that we saw, it's the actual corium that is that has cooled.
Yes, we cannot say this is the melted like a uranium or the corium, but it is highly likely this is the melted fuel for the corium. Yeah. So, but to understand what this brown deposit is, we are now planning to retrieve a small amount of this deposit. So to do that, we constructed this kind of a huge robotics arm. This is jointly developed by Japanese reactor suppliers and a British engineering company. And hopefully in coming, not this year, next year, we want to safely deploy this system into the reactor and try to retrieve some samples of those brown colored corium lux deposit. So now I am just briefly talking about how we have improved the overall work environment on site. By the way, this picture is taken on site. So you can see the workers without any respirator, for example, or heavy protective equipment. You can walk on site where the contamination were are confirmed to be very low. So right after the accident, the entire area of the site is categorized as highly contaminated area. So whenever you come into the site, you have to put this kind of full protective wear. And I myself put on those protective wear to support our robotics investigation work on site. But now, a majority of area we categorize as a green area where you do not need to put this kind of heavy protective gear. And sorry, this is very small picture, but now we regularly welcome a lot of visitors. And so those visitors do not need to wear masks or heavy protective gear. Just even they come in front of damaged reactor buildings. I think this is quite extraordinary pictures. And to do that, we have doing a lot of decontamination work on site.
Yeah, but I think the biggest threat today is basically the COVID, so that's why they have to wear a mask, not because of this.
True. So this shows the workers' radioactive exposure. So this is March 2011. This, in average, the worker on this month at the time of the accident get 20 millisievert radiation exposure. This is quite high. And of course, this is average. So I think if I remember correctly, the highest radioactive dose the worker get is, I think, around 700 millisievert. That is higher than the legally allow permitted exposure for the workers on nuclear industry in Japan. But this value has now been decreased significantly, now just 0.2 millisievert per month. So this also shows how to say, we came to reduce the radiation exposure to workers. And now I'm just talking about local recovery and reconstruction and what we are doing for supporting those efforts. The first, this shows the radioactive levels right after the accident. Now, there are natural decay of the radioactive nuclei. So it is, I think, to some extent expected the levels of the contamination is decreased, but at the same time, under the leadership of the Japanese Environment Ministry, we have conducted extensive decontamination on the surrounding community. So this shows, looks, I think Andrew showed us a similar slide, but this shows the current evacuation zone. So most of the evacuation area put in place right after the accident are lifted, but those red colored area were designated as how to say, hard to decontaminate area. So we were, of course, expected those area is how to say, area we have to deal with in long term. And I also wanted to say that everyone talk about Fukushima. So Fukushima is one of the 47 prefectures in Japan in this green colored area. This is Fukushima Prefecture. But this evacuation zone is not small, 370 square kilometers, but just I think about 2% of this Fukushima Prefecture. So whenever we talked about this Fukushima Daiichi accident, we try to, how to say, not to give, how to say, negative view on the entire Fukushima Prefecture. Because majority of the Fukushima Prefecture, people do everyday life without any problem. And I myself went to one of the best ski resort in Fukushima Prefecture in around like 2013 or 14. And I really enjoyed it. And that is one of the, how to say, might be misunderstanding among non-Japanese people. So this shows the number of the people the forced to evacuate. But I'm saying I just said forced, but some of them I think voluntarily evacuated outside of their how to say living their local community. So right after the accident, the evacuation is 160,000. Right now, more than 40,000. So by gradually lifting of the evacuation order, the people starting coming back their local community, but because it takes so long, 10 years after the accident, and those evacuated people settled in the other area, including the metropolitan Tokyo area, and maybe their children went to the school at the new area and have already established the community in those area where they evacuated. So it is now not so not small people, not small number of people who evacuated. Some of them chose not to return their original local area. So that is also one of the how to say the major impact into the local community. We TEPCO try to help recover and reconstruct those local community as much as we could. So we helping hand to the clearing the levels because after the accident they had to evacuate. So their house and their flat and their rooms are quite messy. So we try to help clearing out those messy their home sometimes, and also we help to decontamination work by giving radioactive measurement on the surrounding area. So this is a little bit busy slide, but I'm not going to detail. But the government formulated so-called mid and long-term roadmap, which set some key milestone we try to achieve in the course of accident response and decommissioning. And we will how to say make our effort to achieve those milestones. But this is not just a issue of TEPCO and government, the local communities expect us to progress decommissioning as steadily as possible, I would say, and as safely as possible. So we try to get understanding of the local community when we proceed decommissioning. So the local community is a key stakeholder of the decommissioning. And the decommissioning is, how to say, decommissioning and also the recovery and the reconstruction of the local community must come hand in hand to proceed. So we try to reach local stakeholders by having the venue to have dialogue, and also we welcome a lot of visitors on site. 2 years ago, we have 18,000 visitors on site. So we established visitor centers to specifically cater to the visitors from Japan and also around the world.
And that's in the plant itself, not in the area.
Yes, that's plant. So you can see the people looking over the damaged reactor. So I hope you might have a chance to visit our site on someday. And finally, in the couple of slides, I will show the impact of this accident in the overall picture of the Japanese energy supply. I'm sorry, some color codes are not consistent, but what I want to show, before the accident, the nuclear power is about a third of the power in Japan. But now, it's 2016, but right now I think this number is about 6% of electricity come from nuclear power. So significantly reduced before the accident, because we had more than 50 operational nuclear power before the accident. Right now, only 9 reactors have restarted after passing the tough Japanese regulatory requirement. And the current Japanese energy policy state the Japan aiming for 20 to 22% of the power come from nuclear in 2030. This is a government strategic policy right now. But this policy is regularly updated, and this year, this will be updated. And because of the decent focus around the world for the transition to the low carbon society, how Japan, or whether Japan make use of nuclear power is, I think, one of the biggest discussion points on formulating this Japanese national energy policy. So this shows the evolution of the Japanese electricity generation asset. After I think somewhere around here, there's an oil shock. So Japan embarking on the nuclear power, and also increase the LNG or the natural gas thermal power. And you can see clearly, visibly, the nuclear almost disappear after the accident. And thankfully, the renewable started increasing. But still, I would say that Japan is heavily relied on the fossil fuel. And also one point I would say, Japanese population started decreasing some years ago. So and also economy is not expanding rapidly anymore. So the overall total energy demand was not increasing sometime before the Fukushima Daiichi accident. Yeah, that is our overall trend. I think this is my last slide. So I think you can easily understand the Japanese CO2 emission increased after the accident. Oh, sorry, this is the last slide. I think this is giving the current status of each reactors. 9 reactors have restarted. 7 reactors have the initial phase of the regulatory review. But I think 24 reactors, the operators or utility decided to decommission because those, how to say, usually a little bit old and the small capacity reactor does not make sense for the massive investment needed to do safety enhancement to meet a regulatory requirement. Well, thank you for listening to my very long presentation.
Well, thank you, really, Naoto. And I'm sure that we have a lot of quite technical people in the attendance, and I'm pretty much sure that they have been very interested because I can see that we have a lot of questions that have been asked. So thank you very much. And I think it's really a very rare occasion to have actual first-hand experience of people who went on site, worked on site, and know what they are talking about. So I think we are all very grateful for you taking the time to go through that presentation. Thanks again. So maybe I think I'm going to start with the questions that people asked for your presentation, simply because it's still fresh on everybody's memories. So if you don't mind us continuing going through questions, quite a lot of questions about the water, the stored water, contaminated water. So first, how much of the water has been and is still being reprocessed and recycled to go through the reactors again, and how much is it do you have to store basically?
Oh, I think we can look back onto my slide. There are number, but I just if I say verbally, about 200 tons of water a day injected back into the 3 reactors, 200 tons. And as I said, about 140 tons a day, we get the inflow of the groundwater. So we recirculated 200 tons a day, but we get 140 tons every day from rain and groundwater. Okay. And this 140 tons we have to store on site.
Yeah. Okay, I get it. Okay, and we also saw on the slides that the amount of contaminated water generated every day decreased through time. Is this because basically you optimize the process to reprocess it, or is it just simply because the residual heat of the reactors decreased, so you needed actually less water?
Yes. So because the melted fuel, the heat generated from the melted fuel keep decreasing because of the so-called radioactive decay. So when you wait, this radioactive substances decrease the amount of heat it gives off. So that is one reason why we have decreasing the amount of water we inject into the reactor core. But I think my explanation is not about that, but about decreasing this 140 tons of water we get from the rain and groundwater. So this is not related to this decay heat or the amount of injection. This is achieved by multiple measures, as I said. So we even, inserted a kind of the pipe, 30 meters, I think, deep, around 4 reactors. And we injected the freezing fluid into this pipe. And what we achieved is we freeze the soil around these 4 reactor buildings to get kind of a wall, underground frozen wall, to stop the groundwater coming into the inside of this wall. So that is one of the measures, but multiple measures contribute to this reducing of the generate of the contaminated water.
Okay, I get it. And actually, you answered also a question which was asked about this underground frozen wall. It is a feat of engineering, I guess, to have something that big, that large, and keeping it frozen through time. And I guess it's very helpful indeed to reduce the amount of water that gets in.
Yes.
So still on the water, the tritium that is currently in the contaminated water, is it there? Was it always there because of it was already in the reactor during its operation, or is it still being generated? So is now new tritium being generated, or it's just basically the initial quantity that you have to deal with?
I think because we get this clean, fresh, contaminated water coming into this circulation loop, I would say, and then we inject this clean water into the reactors, and this clean water come contact with those radioactive corium, and this water come out to the basement, and then basically we pumped up and clean it and stored on site on those many tanks, and I would say the amount of the tritium is just increased with the amount of the water we store on site.
Okay, so there's new tritium being generated through time, basically.
Yes, maybe I have to look into the detail to answer the technical correct answer.
Okay, I get it. Okay, and so regarding the discharge, because I understand that this is now the preferred option, or the studied option, is to discharge the water into ocean after reprocessing it through the ALPS that we saw in the slide. Instead of doing all that, somebody asked what they called a naive question. Why don't you just take this water, put it into tankers, and then discharge it into the middle of the ocean where it wouldn't worry anybody? Because I'm not saying hurt anybody, but at least the local fishermen wouldn't be worried about, and the general population, everybody would not be worried about.
Yeah, I think I had similar questions a couple of times in the past. I think my understanding is there is an international treaty to prohibit disposing any waste on high sea, and that is prohibited by this treaty, I think.
Okay, which makes sense because, of course, we know about the older dumpings of radioactive waste into the ocean, and it wouldn't look good there, I guess.
Well, yeah, we're already letting out tritium into the ocean all the time, like we were seeing. So I wonder, I don't know the details of this treaty. Does it allow, remediated water? Is there a level at which it's allowed, or is it all radioactive materials, which seems a little arbitrary and absurd? I don't know the answer to that.
It does sound like the worry about the water is way bigger than the risk of the water. So it looks like the handling of it is more done for people worrying than for people really being impacted or having any kind of adverse effects. And so which leads to the next question, as clearly the international community seem to be convinced that doing this kind of discharging of water in a controlled way is the best solution with probably no impact. How do you explain the hesitation from the government? Why do you think they cannot take an easy decision or a quick decision on that?
This is not just a technical issue anymore. So this is quite big societal national problem. It has become now in Japan. So for example, the local fishermen have suffered a lot from this accident. They could not doing their work, their fishing work for many years. But now, because of our meticulous, I think I'd say the analysis of the samples of the fishery product, they are now ready to I think expand or restart their fishery livelihood. So that by allowing TEPCO to discharge this water into the ocean must give significantly reputational damage to their products. Mm-hmm. So I think some of the fishermen even understand that this is not giving any health effect, but they are not only concerned about themselves, but they are concerned about how the general public in Japan respond. The general public, some of the general public still are concerned about buying products from the Fukushima. And some of the best agriculture and fishery products from Fukushima, the price of those products are still lower than the equivalent product from other areas of Japan. So this is the big problem, not only just the fishery people, but all
agriculture.
Yeah.
So even in Japan, there still is a kind of a stigma around produce coming from the region. It's still not okay for most people or for a part of the population.
I don't say many, but some people still have concern. Yes.
Okay, and I assume that there are still surveys and measurements and everything to monitor the actual level of radioactivity of the food and seafood and everything. I guess it's still going on.
Yes.
So just about the question of the farm produce, is it is sold, but it's sold at a lower price than it ought to be. So there is a price to that stigma.
Okay, we have a viewer who asked, apparently there are legal limits which are applicable to Fukushima, which are very low compared to the international standards, I assume regarding fish, produce, water and everything. So do you have any idea why basically the government set the bar so low and set such a strict limit?
I think, yeah, Andrew, go ahead, please.
Well, no, I do know a little bit about this narrative. So because the limits were changed very suddenly in the period of 2011, and the intention was to restore confidence by making things stricter. It ended up having the opposite effect, though, because, for example, by lowering the limits, then it seemed that there was more contaminated products. So the irony also was that rather than inspire confidence by, the Japanese government saying, look, we're looking out for you, it made people think, oh, why are you changing the story now? You must not have either made a right decision before, so there's a cover up here to some degree. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 that even when you try and help people, they see it maliciously sometimes.
I get it. And I guess that I'm really asking in a naive way, what is the image of TEPCO today, and can they still engage in public communication to try to reverse, I would say, the reputational damage, or are they seen now as somehow part of the problem and they are not trustworthy anymore? I don't know if there's a clear image in Japan, but do you think there's an opinion on that?
So I am employee of TEPCO, so my view is maybe quite biased, I'd say.
Of course.
But I'm saying, so the trust to the TEPCO was significantly damaged, and still nowhere near to the good trust. So I think TEPCO is generally quite how to say, the local affected people, of course, have quite a negative view on TEPCO. And it is not only just an accident, but during the course of these 10 years, we had occasion to leaking contaminated water into the environment, and we had an issue where the worker, how to say, like suffered some industry accident, and we didn't reach the milestone, the deadline where we pledged to achieve until this time. So so I think largely speaking, I think TEPCO does not get the trust among not only local but general public. But I just show the slide about the voluntary effort from TEPCO employees. So some local key stakeholders kindly, I'd say, started thinking this is what it is. So to accelerate the recovery and the reconstruction, they regard TEPCO as a partner to work together. So that is one good sign, I would say. And Andrew might have some view over him.
I don't know if I can add too much to this, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but don't worry, Andrew. I have a lot of questions for you too, so don't worry. Yeah, so thanks a lot again, Naoto, for taking time to do this and answering the questions. It's really, really interesting having somebody who is so directly involved in this, taking time to talk to us. So then some questions for Andrew. Yeah, let's start with maybe the most very specific ones. So some people saw the headline of the Guardian newspaper, which said 70% higher risk for female cancer. And they were wondering whether you have any kind of info on where that came from and how they could print something like that. It's a very specific question, so sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, and to tell you the truth, I'd have to return to the article because to look into detail about the claims that were made in that specific article. But I believe, if I remember what it was about, it was an extrapolation based on assumptions, not an actual, we've mapped this out. It was a prediction made in 2011 and one that doesn't necessarily bear out. We do largely know that Sorry?
No, it's the infamous might, the headlines which contain the word might, and then which became facts, basically.
Right, exactly. A self-fulfilling prophecy, sort of. So what we do know is that there was a lot of attention and extensive scanning done of the Fukushima evacuees and people who were affected to see if there was an increase in cancer, and no, there wasn't. And the way we would have seen it would have been thyroid cancer. That's the obvious and clear sign. What they found is they found more cancers, but because they were looking more. If all of us have cancers in us at different times, and if you look really, 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 really hard, you'll find them. It's only when they become large and dangerous that we normally become aware of them. But the more you look, the more you'll find. That was what we learned.
Yeah, which makes sense, unfortunately. And while the media reaction at the time, I would say during the early crisis or during really right after the explosions and everything, why it might have seemed appropriate. How do you analyze the fact that even 10 years later now, we still have quite some frenzy as soon as we talk about Fukushima despite all the facts, despite all the, I would say, less than catastrophic news that we've had ever since? How do you analyze that it's still somehow a topic which immediately brings on all the old images?
Well, and what we're touching on now is the emotional reactions, because not everything is decided by logic. One of the things I noted in my research is when you have pro-nuclear sources, they talk about statistics, they talk about facts, and the anti-nuclear sources make an emotional appeal. So here's someone, could this person have been affected? And we don't talk in terms of, you know, how much it is. It's simply this sort of, someone is affected, therefore, we don't need to explain the details. You can infer it. And this is one of these things that where I talked about where the danger is inferred rather than stated. That can be even scarier. They often say the scariest monster movies are the ones where you don't see the monster. So this has to do with styles of communication, methods of communication. And one of the things is to use different communication styles that land with different people. So you can't present facts for everyone. That won't land with some people. You need to find ways to engage people in different and creative and dynamic ways to get the reactions you want. And I think that's almost the trickier thing, is how to create this variety of message or get out of the style of messaging that seems natural or logical or would work for you. You need to find these other people who do not think like you, and how will they process it? And it's hard to prove a negative. How do you say there is no danger? There's no visible explanation of this. That's just, you know, the nature of being in existence. And yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting question, I think. An answer when you talk about facts versus feelings and impressions, because I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. I think that's something that really needs to be addressed. And if we take the communications from UNSCARE or any other scientific body, it's going to be a full, I would say, a document of figures, tables, and very interesting graphics, but that's not what gets to most people. So I think you're completely right when you say that, yeah, we need some kind of citizen voice to talk to citizens about what everyday people see, and not just scientific facts, which are not easy to understand. The one viewer also asked the question, apparently, we might say that Chernobyl showed that you cannot hide the truth forever. So although the Soviet system tried to hide it even from themselves, somehow from their leaders, eventually it came out, because at some point people saw what was going on, and they had to somehow admit, at first a bit and then more and more, being transparent. Do you think that this somehow indicates that maybe we cannot contain misinformation forever, and maybe at some point the actual impact of the accident will somehow come out and still reach most of the public in one way?
I think, yeah, the information is out there, and the era of absolute secrecy is long over. Everyone has access to an amazing wealth of information, and everyone can, at a moment, discover something and report it to the whole world. So the era where you could ever keep something secret, I think, that belongs to the past. There's billions of cell phones in the world. And I always think it's incredible what people seem to believe politicians or elites are capable of keeping secrets. Politicians can't even keep corruption secret. So it's bizarre that people sometimes imagine politicians are super geniuses capable of giant conspiracies, but also morons who aren't capable of things. There's a double think there, and it's tricky. And, you know, this is maybe off topic, but I had an argument with someone while I was visiting in Spain, this Irish guy who is a real skeptic. He thinks, you know, elites are poisoning the world. Everything is terrible. He's one of these people who believes that when planes fly by, they put poisons in the sky.
Chemtrails, yeah.
Chemtrails. And he said, the one thing I can't reconcile is, why would they poison themselves? They're breathing the same air. I'm like, yes, you're right. Why would that make sense? Think a little harder, man, you know? I only touched on nuclear power and things very lightly with him because he had a number of unusual beliefs. But I did try and tell him, no, these things are safe. But he didn't want to believe me because, there's a sort of a powerful appeal to a narrative about I don't believe the authorities. I have the real truth. And people often want to feel special. A really hilarious meme I saw in the last couple of weeks was someone sitting at their computer saying, "Look, honey, I found some information that all the doctors and scientists in the world missed."
Yeah, of course, makes sense. Yeah, well, it's which still means that it's an uphill battle basically to get the facts out, and I think we still have associations like ours still have a lot of work to do and a lot of communication to do, and it's I don't think we are close to seeing the end of the battle. I would say I think it's still a lot of effort to go into to get facts through, and it's very helpful to have people like you who both have the facts and then also can take a broader picture and I would say put things into perspective. So again, thank you for being with us tonight and taking the time to answer our questions. Mirto, maybe you want to say a few final words before we conclude?
Yes, thank you very much, Silvio, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you to our two speakers. I'm going to go fast because we passed a little bit the time, but not that much, but it was sincerely passionating, so every minute was worth. I just wanted to say that from all the work we've done at the Voices recently to, and I'm sorry for the background children voices, I'll try to speak louder. So from all the work we've done at the Voices and from everything that we've seen and from everything that we've listened to the two webinars yesterday and today, I don't think honestly that there's been another industrial accident or another accident that has ever been as covered, that has been that studied, that researched, that have been the sharing of information has been so transparent worldwide, literally worldwide, with all the best experts worldwide investing the time, resources, and all expertise, of course, in that topic. And despite that, and that's what you've all said, despite that, we are faced to the good old discrimination. I mean, it's just a fantasy, a myth turned into reality and facts that touches the local people, that touches a technology, that touches people who have been confronted to the accident at the time. And again, it's the good old stigma, and that turns it back onto science, onto facts, and on the very needs of humanity itself. And it's really scary because history has taught us that it never ends well when we turn our backs to facts and to science, and we forget to rely on things to help us in the future and to take us through those challenges that we're facing. And those challenges are what? Today we have to collectively be carbon neutral in 30 years. I mean, 30 years, it's amazing to think that in 30 years from now, we have to have displaced 90% of our energy sources. So I think we've talked a lot about the media, and thank you so much, Andrew, for highlighting that again. I think there's been, and there is still today, a huge amount of work that it's being done by you guys in Japan and by TEPCO company and people who are taking their responsibility as much and to the greater extent that they humanly can. I think we can say that without being targeted of doing and saying too much, but it is also our responsibility as people, as individuals, to make the effort of learning about it, of opening our minds to an information that is not the one that we think it is, and to try to make the effort to understand what are the facts about what may be one of the biggest solutions we have at hand to fight the challenges to come. And one of those is climate change. Other ones are scarcity of resources, air pollution, energy scarcity to development. And I don't think it's responsible at all to not reopen that case. And we should reopen that case of the Fukushima nuclear accident
and its subsequent effect, so we can close it once and for all and get on with our lives. That's
okay, it's a good conclusion actually. So thanks a lot. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to people who connected and watched us. I'd like to remind you that this is going to stay on YouTube because we have a YouTube channel. You can also find us on Instagram, on Twitter, both in French and English, on LinkedIn. We have a website, we have a newsletter, so you can stay easily in touch. And of course, you can, if you didn't already do so, you can join us, of course. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Naoto. Thanks to the people who made it work in the background. Thanks a lot, guys. And who knows, maybe we can see each other again, or can contribute again together in some way to our common goal, let's say. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening.